Okay, hello everyone out there in GMAT Club land. Good morning, good evening, afternoon, whatever time of day it is for you. I hope you are having a good day. My name is Maria Wich-Vila, and for those of you who don't know me, I'm a graduate of Harvard Business School and the founder of ApplicantLab.com. If you have started looking for professional advice for your MBA application and are repulsed by the very high prices that admissions consultants charge, please check out ApplicantLab.com. I have 18 years of experience in admissions, and all of my wisdom is available there. So if you didn't use Applicant Lab for your essays, that's okay. I have just an interview module that you can purchase that has all of my advice for all of the top schools interviews. And speaking of interviews, today I am joined by Mervin. Mervin is an applicant to Stanford and recently had his interview and has very kindly, out of the depths of goodness of his heart, agreed to relive his interview experience right here with me. And so what we're going to do is he sent me the questions that he got during his interview. We are going to try to go through them. I don't know that we'll have time to go through it all because the idea is that we'll do the mock interview straight through. Then I will give feedback on different questions. And then after that, we will have a Q&A. So if you've got questions, put them in the chat box. But just please also hold your questions a little bit because they might be answered when we go through the feedback part. And so maybe just sort of wait a little bit so that way you're not wasting your time. Okay, so with that, let's get started. So as for those of you who don't know, Stanford usually almost always has an alumnus or alumna doing the interview. And so that means it's a blind interview. So they have not read any of the essays or recommendations. The interviewer only has your resume. And also, just one quick thing to note, Stanford is very interested in innovation and people who drive new ideas forward. So just so you know, that's going to be the angle of some of the questions that I take, spoiler alert. And so sometimes if you actually don't touch upon that subject in answering another question, they'll just come out and ask you, like, when have you identified an opportunity that no one else has? Or what's the biggest change, positive change you've made in your organization? So just giving you guys a heads up, that's one of the things that makes the Stanford interview different from many, many other schools. So with that little introduction out of the way, hi, Mervin, it's great to meet you.
Hello, Maria, nice to be here. And relive the experience, as you said, and hopefully not mess up the second time.
I hope it's a positive, I hope it's not a traumatic reliving.
Yeah, so like we decided, if I mess up an answer, it was premeditated, and we decided that I'm going to mess it up. But if it's a perfect answer, it's completely my,
That's right. That's right, everyone. So if Mervin gives an answer that isn't good, he's doing that on purpose for educational purposes.
Yeah, let's go with that.
Exactly. I love it. I should just start using that as my excuse. And I'm just kidding. No, but for real, guys.
I thought this through. Yeah, big brain time.
Oh my God, that Stanford, woo, it's that Stanford brain. Okay, so let's get started. Why don't you, I've got your resume in front of me, but why don't you go ahead and just walk me through your resume?
Oh, sure, Maria, I'd love to do that. And so to begin, hi everyone, I'm Mervin. After I graduated from college in 2017, I joined a consumer goods company, XYZ, in, sorry, can you hear me? I hope I'm audible.
I'm just taking notes. Oh, okay. You're fine. I'm just writing furiously.
Oh, cool. So I joined this consumer goods company, and I've held 4 roles in this company. The first role that I held was as a project manager. So I was at site setting up a juices plant. On the site, helping set up a huge plant with more than 400 people on site working together, 15 plus vendors. So what I learned over here was how to deal with a huge team, how to resolve conflicts on sites without taking sides, and take the best decisions strategically possible. So the second role I moved into was in manufacturing. Here I was heading the manufacturing operations for 3 plants, and one of these I was unit head of. So there were 4 direct reportees and 120 workers on site as well. And this is where I realized that having your own team to manage is a lot different from a project management role, and you don't necessarily want to give people roles according to your strengths. You want to challenge them and help them grow. And so that is the one big learning I had in this role. The third role I had with this consumer goods firm was the most interesting one that I had. So over here, I was helping two firms, which was one of them was mine, and another was a nutraceutical firm. And we co-developed products together that we were launching in the Indian consumer market. 3 of them were juices, 4 of them were dairy beverages. And this is where I learned how to manage 2 teams with completely different working styles from 2 different organizations and not take sides. And after this role was completed, the 4th and final role that I held in this firm was with their new category development team, helping identify startups that we could potentially acquire or invest in. So this has been my journey so far.
All right, that's great. Really interesting stuff. So, you're super successful. You're having a really successful early career right now. Looks like you're on a great path. So why do you need an MBA and why are you looking to get it from Stanford?
Oh, sure. So if I understood your question correctly, there are 2 parts to this question. So why do I need an MBA? And also why Stanford? So I'll just take up the first part of the question first, which is why an MBA? So like I mentioned, the most interesting role that I had working with this firm was developing these products together that we launched. And while I was doing this, I realized that this is something I really want to do long term. So seeing my own products launched and in the market space, in those, in the grocery store shelf, I realized that, oh my, this is something I want to do long term. I can contribute in. I have all the experience that I need because I've been in operations, I've been in product development, I've been in project setting up plans. But the one thing that I also realized was that marketing is a domain where I do not have that kind of experience, along with entrepreneurship specifically. And that is the reason, this long-term goal is the reason that I too want to do an MBA and focus on these skills, especially marketing, entrepreneurship, and of course, leadership. And I feel that Stanford is the right place for me. Now, moving on to the second part of your question, why Stanford? So there are 4 main reasons why I want to do an MBA at Stanford. So the first one is the small, close-knit community that is at Stanford. I realized benefits of this approach when I was applying to Stanford and I was in touch with an alum. And then I realized that, okay, this particular alum got me in touch with so many other people within this small group. They were current students that I could talk to, and they helped me understand the process. And that is when I realized that, okay, the small knit community is tight knit and they can help me realize my goals better. The second reason I want to go to Stanford is because of the unique leadership program that Stanford offers. So I myself want to apply to Stanford's Arbuckle leadership program, and talking to an alum over there. So her exact words were that even though in this program you're coaching other MBA 1 students, you learn more about yourself in this journey. And that is really something that resonates a lot with me because I've also been a counselor in my undergrad where I coached students and also an alum. So yes, this is again an aspect of the Stanford education that I really like. The third reason is, of course, the the entrepreneurial and marketing program. I know that the Stanford Consumer and Retail Club hosts all of these activities that can help connect me with the alums there, and also the close proximity to Silicon Valley with all these entrepreneurs coming into Stanford and giving all the talks. And all of this happens every week. So that is really exciting. And I think it's really helpful for me in my long-term goal. And my fourth and final reason is that all of these classes that are, across the street, the unique opportunity at Stanford to take up, let's say, a negotiations class in the law school, which is more intense. And I know that I am very conflict averse. So that is something I'm also looking forward to, along with this class at design school, so that I can really map out this consumer journey when I'm building my own product.
So you've touched upon your long-term goal, and you said that it's because of this project that you worked on at work, launching new beverage products into the market. Is there any other motivation behind your interest in this field?
Oh, sure. So to get into that, we need to get into why I got into this journey with this consumer goods company that I worked for. So even as a kid, I really loved experimenting with products in the kitchen, in the bathroom, and coming up with all sorts of weird formulations that made no sense. I had So chemistry was my passion. So that is the reason why I chose chemical engineering. That is why I got into college. I did an internship with another consumer goods firm in new product development. And this has really been my lifelong passion. So that is why I joined this consumer goods company as well. But then getting into the midst of it, getting into the technical know-how and getting people together to launch the products, that is what I realized is what I want to do. And then I realized that this is my long-term goal and this is something I want to achieve.
All right. All right, great. So can you tell me about a time that you failed?
Oh, sure. There's definitely been those kind of moments in my career. But the one that comes to mind, right up front is when I just started off. So I was in this factory, like I mentioned in project, setting up this huge plant. And there were so many people working there that conflicts were bound to happen. And I just came in as a 22-year-old hotshot. Okay, I'm going to set this place in order. And what I did not realize was that maybe that's not the best way to do it. So the particular instance that happened was that there was this vendor, a huge vendor, who was constantly flouting the safety norms. And one day there was a near miss incident. And what I did with this, what I did when this happened was that I suspended the work permit for the day. Now, as a consequence of this huge vendor with lots of resources on site couldn't work for an entire day. They had more than 200 people on site who couldn't work. So that was a huge financial loss for them. And this, even though this achieved my objective to, put in that fear that you can't break rules, it was probably not the best way to do it. And I know this because it really spoiled my relation and my rapport with the site team over there. Over time, I realized that I could have talked this out. I could have spoken to my fellow project managers, gotten them together, and probably come to a resolution which did not involve taking such a drastic step. But then I learned from this mistake. And again, in my third role, when I was working with these two organizations who were working on two products together, there were again a lot of disagreements. And one of my fellow managers did suggest that, okay, maybe you should escalate this to the CEO, get someone to step in. But no, this time I remember that it's best to get these people together, get them talking to each other, and really figure out the root cause rather than point fingers and, take any drastic steps. I think it was a personal failure to me. So that is why I chose this example.
All right, totally great. Don't worry, we've all had failures. At least those of us who are human, which tends to be all of us. All right, so what is your proudest achievement?
Oh, sure. The achievement that I'm most proud of is when, again, like I mentioned, I was in this third role, building these new products together. So launching these co-developed products with my firm and this nutraceutical firm that we were tied up with, these co-branded products, is the highlight of my career and something that I'm most proud of. And I'm most proud of it because of three reasons. Because of one reason, which was that there were so many issues over here. When I got into this project, I realized that both these teams have very different styles of working. My organization, even though it's a huge established one, the particular category that I worked in was very small and startup-like. So they were very agile. They wanted to do things fast. Whereas this other more established firm was more methodical. They had an approach to doing things and they wanted to take things, one step at a time. And there was this huge clash of interest when the two product development teams got together and they realized that when they made this product, they actually messed up because these two teams were not talking to each other and just going ahead with the formulations. They actually used a few ingredients that did not, suit the product, and it violated our product claims. And one of these products actually failed the shelf life studies 3 months into the program. And at this point, going back would have been a huge cost implication and also a huge delay because we were aiming for a summer launch, which was not going to happen. So what I did in this time was that, as I mentioned before, I learned from my previous failure. I knew that don't go all Warhammer on them. Get these people talking together. Make sure that you understand the root cause. And that is when I realized that the root cause of the problem is that they think that whoever comes up with a solution to this problem has to take responsibility for causing it in the first place. So that is why they were not talking to each other about it. Once I got that out of the way, I told them there's no need to assign blame. We actually came up with solutions. But more than that, I realized that because these two teams were so different and they had these opposite styles of working, they were also complementary. So I readjusted the project matrix in such a way that both teams were given tasks according to their strengths. For example, my team was better at, let's say, packaging development or product development. I gave that part to them. I knew that the other firm, which was more established, was really good with their regulatory and legal teams. So those parts of the project I assigned to them. And because these two teams were so codependent on each other, they really had to talk. There was no option out of it. And that is how I got these two teams together. But I also knew that this is not all, because you can get people together and they're going to talk, but you also need to make sure that something like this does not happen again. So even at my personal expense, I asked my COO to set up these monthly reviews with the CEO so that both these teams know that they're being watched. And even though it invites bigger scrutiny into my project, I knew that this was necessary to keep them both on track. And this is, I would say, the biggest achievement of my career.
So you were in charge of this team from the beginning. So why didn't you quite catch that this was a problem very early on? Why did it even have to get to this phase when finally it's like, oh, the thing, it went moldy on a shelf 3 months into it, and oops, maybe the formulation isn't good. If you could do it again, how would you do it differently? Maybe that's
what I would do differently is probably adopt the best practices of both firms. What I did wrong over here, what I think I did wrong was that I was too engrossed in my own superior work culture coming in from my team. So I was following their processes. What I did not know at that moment was that the other organization had a superior process and it was better to follow theirs. So this is something that I feel I could not have known at that point of time, because my agenda was to launch products as fast as possible. But that was not the best approach. So if I had to do this thing all over again, I would get these two teams talking together to each other instead of me as a liaison between them, just passing information from one team to the other. I would get them talking to each other head on. And that is what I did. Like a month or two into the project, I realized that every week I need to set up these cross-functional meetings with both product development teams sitting together and discussing the formulations rather than working in silos.
Was there anything new that you helped drive in terms of processes, not just the weekly meetings, but in terms of like the product development process itself? Like, was there any sort of new ideas that you had to sort of innovate on the fly as part of this project?
Sure, yeah. In fact, one of the great consequences of redesigning this entire product portfolio, the product project management, the responsibilities, was that because we were not doing all of these redundant processes over and over again, like both teams aren't working on the same things at the same time, we could save a lot of time. And what that helped was, with this extra time that we had, the marketing teams of both sides had a lot of time. And me, of course, helping guide the process, we had this time to come up with new products that we could pitch to the CEOs. And one of these is actually being launched. It has actually been launched this September. So that as a consequence of saving time, we could devote more time to innovation and more time to getting newer ideas on the shelf instead of, fighting it out and trying to figure things out in the process.
All right, great. So can you describe an experience where you contributed to what a team was doing? You weren't the leader, because you just told me about a time you were a leader of a big group. What about a time that you were on a team and you were contributing or helping the team, but you weren't in fact a leader? Can you give me a sense of how you act when you're on a team that you're not in charge of?
Oh, sure. I have an example that fits the bill. So in my second role, when I was the manufacturing manager, so when I just got into the role, I saw that there was this plan that we had newly set up, and they were following these processes that did not make a lot of sense. They were doing a lot of traditional processes. So just to give you an example, the process that I'm talking about is called a changeover. So what happens is that, let's say you're producing orange juice and now you want to produce mixed fruit juice. You can't just, start off producing mixed fruit. There's a cleaning process in between. So what they were doing was they were following a process which was set out by the OEM or the original equipment manufacturer, which was in fact the most, let's say, the most strict protocol there is, which was costing us a lot of money. And I tried questioning that, okay, maybe we can do things differently. Maybe there's a better way to do it. There's a cheaper way to do it. But the fact is that because I was so swamped with my own works and managing all these other plants, I could not devote time to it. And I also knew that this problem wasn't as easy as it looked like. It was a serious problem that needed a proper algorithm to solve. And thankfully for me, 2 or 3 months after I started working, this new teammate joined. He was fresh out of college and he had a lot of experience working with, he had a lot of experience with coding and coming up with applications and problem solving. So I brought him on board, and this person X had a real knack for it. And while I was guiding him through the process, helping him understand what was happening in the plant, he really put in the effort to build this product and launch it. And we actually presented this in one of the competitions that my firm hosts, and we placed as a second runner-up. And this problem and in fact, there were so many cost-saving opportunities out of it that it got replicated in a few other plants as well. So I would say that was a nice achievement that could not have been possible without this other person showing up and doing the heavy lifting.
All right, great. Well, sounds like he was a great addition to your team.
Sure
those are
was.
all of the questions that I have, Mervyn, but thank you so much for your time. It was great to meet you.
Oh, thank you, Maria. It was a pleasure talking to you.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you so much for this. Okay, so I think overall you did really well. I think one of the things I liked is there were several times where because I don't work in manufacturing and food products, right? And I don't know, I know that the schools do try to match you with someone who has a background that is somewhat similar to yours, but the chances of somebody being from the exact same background is not always, 100% guaranteed. And so there were times when you sort of explained, you could have just said in that last answer, something along the lines of, oh, we had to do a changeover at the manufacturing plant. And so blah, 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 it's expensive. And I wouldn't have been able to picture it. But when you said, well, sometimes we're making orange juice and then we need to switch to making a different type of juice, to switch, to get the equipment ready to, make that other type of juice, it's expensive, it's time consuming, et cetera. And so that really helped me as an outsider who doesn't live in your world, picture what was going on. One thing I say often is that, when you are telling a story about something that you lived through, you've got a movie in your head, right? You can picture exactly what did the plant look like? What did the person's face look like? Who said what? How noisy was it? Like, you have an entire sensory memory of what that experience was like. And I have a blank screen. So part of the challenge for anyone in any interview is thinking about, okay, what are the details I need to tell that they get enough of a picture so that they can imagine what was going on, the vital things that were going on, without going into details that don't really matter. Like, it doesn't matter that the person was wearing a yellow suit that day, right? One of those protective suits. It doesn't matter that, it was April 15th and it was a sunny day. Like, those things well, it might matter, but in these stories, it doesn't matter. So one of the challenges that a lot of people have when I'm doing mock interviews is finding that balance between what are the details I need to provide, just enough so that they get it, but not so many that I'm being irrelevant. And I think for the most part, you walked that fine line very well. Some people tend to go way into the weeds with a ton of details that I'm like, I don't care, or they completely forget that I have no idea how a juice factory works, and they just assume that I do, and I'm like, I am lost. Okay, so I think that's something that you did really well. So now let's go through, and I'm going to go through my notes question by question and just sort of see what jumped out at me. So I think, one of the things that I think is good with like a walk me through your resume type of question is that it really gives you a chance to introduce the person, not just to your technical background, like what is on the page of the resume, but it also gives you a chance to share stories of your life that inform your career decisions. So when I asked you later on, like, well, how did you even get interested in food, and why is this your long-term vision? I think since your background ties in so nicely with what you want to do, in the future. And since it really does seem that you made deliberate choices in choosing employers that would move you in that direction, because some people just sort of, they fall into something by accident, or they do that first job and it's a terrible fit, and then they move to the second job, it's a better fit. But you've been very deliberate in your choices. And so I think one of the things you could have said is, after school, I joined a consumer goods company, because that specializes in a certain type of beverage, because I've just always been passionate about food. Ever since I was a kid, I was always mixing things together in the kitchen. I've always been working on recipes with my mom. And so that's why I went to this company. And then here are the 4 roles that I had, only because it helps me feel, it establishes a foundation, so that later when you say, well, here's what I want to do, those pieces of the puzzle lock together so much more strongly, as opposed to like, what he wants to do consumer goods, but like, why did you even do consumer goods in the first place? You could have gone to petroleum. Given your engineering background, that's what a lot of people that study what you study end up going into. And so I think just sort of setting that stage. Now, if somebody's background or personal story has 0 impact whatsoever into their career plans or the choices they've made, then don't say this part, right? But since in your case it does, I think it could have been a good way to add that extra bit of connection and to set a foundation where the subsequent answers link together a little bit more. Then you proceeded to mention the 4 jobs that you have had. One thing I really liked was that at the end of every job description, you mentioned what you had learned from each position. That is a great thing to do, because otherwise you're simply rattling off a bunch of statistics and it was 120 people in a factory that had 500,000 square feet, or, you're just like, there were 4 plants, 120 employees. There's a lot of like statistics being thrown at me. But if you focus on, well, this is where I learned how to resolve conflict. This is how I learned how to manage a huge team. This is how I learned to assign assignments to people, not just based on their strengths, but also in terms of their stretches. So I think that was very good. In fact, I would have, I don't know, I almost feel like that part to me, as an interviewer, as someone who was looking for leaders, to join my university, my MBA program, and then graduate and go out in the world and kick lots of butt and make my school proud. That almost matters more to me than how many plants with how many employees. I can understand that you said that because it was a big number and it's impressive. The thing though is that I'm not hiring you to manage my plants and my 200 employee plants. That's not the job you're interviewing for. When you're not interviewing for a job as a plant manager. You're interviewing for the job of I am a future leader that's going to make your school proud, right? I'm going to be great when I'm on campus, and I'm going to be great when I graduate. And so I think definitely you could say things like, well, I was managing 4 plants, but I would focus more on those managerial lessons that you learned. You didn't do too much of this, but I would even pull back a little bit on some of the details. I think the next one you were also talking a little bit about the statistics, and it was this many people and this many plants. I'm not hiring you quite for that job, but I loved the focus on the interpersonal skills that you learned. So anyone listening to this, when I talk about the lessons, I don't mean the technical lessons. I don't mean I learned the flow dynamics of the fluid delta calculus stuff. Like, that's not the lesson that's interesting to them. What's interesting to them are these interpersonal and leadership lessons, and you described those very well. So yeah, and you put things together very well. One thing you could have also done is, if you didn't, you could have also set the stage for the 4 jobs. And you might have done this. I'm just writing notes frantically, and so I can't always you can't see it. I can't write down every word because I'm not Superman. But you could have said something like, my name is whatever, and after this I went to, I'm really into food since my whole life, and I went to this company, and while there I've had 4 different roles. Each one has given me exposure to different parts of the company. Everything from manufacturing to new product development to now startup acquisitions. And then you can get into the details. So you can almost sort of set the stage for, here's what's coming, or here's the summary of what I've done. So that way, if the interviewer, because the interviewers are human, if the interviewer's attention wanders after a few seconds and they're like, what am I going to make for dinner tonight? Oh, I have to pick up my kid from soccer practice, right? Because they're just human and this happens. At least you've gotten out the elevator pitch of your career so far. But this was a good job. This is just me being nitpicky, because otherwise this would not be a very interesting video for people who are watching it.
Sure, no, I appreciate it. Because this is something I genuinely thought that, okay, this is something I can incorporate. So thank you.
Excellent. Good. I'm glad to hear that. Okay. So why an MBA? Why Stanford? Oh, so here you said, well, it's a two-part question, which it was. So let me answer both of them together. I think you could have again, this answer was a good answer. I think you could have interwoven this answer a little bit more. Just because I'm asking two questions together doesn't mean you have to go like, okay, let me answer question 1 and then let me answer question 2. So you answered them almost like as discrete questions in that order. You could have maybe saved a little bit of time by consolidating them together. So for example, you said, well, you started saying, well, I when I was on this project, when I was we were launching new products. I want to do that. In the long term, I want to continue doing that. I've already been in operations, product, and running plants and things. So again, that sort of summary line, I think I would have preferred to see that and walk me through your resume just to set the stage, but it's fine. But what I don't have is marketing and entrepreneurial leadership. And so you could have said something like, look, in the long term, I've already had a lot of experience with this, blah, blah, blah. In the long term, I want to launch my own food or beverage company. And there's no place like Stanford for entrepreneurs who want to really go out there and change the world. And so one of the things I'm lacking right now is, the biggest knowledge gap I have right now is entrepreneurship. And Stanford's entrepreneurial offerings are fantastic, blah, blah, blah. The other gap I have is marketing, and then so that way you're sort of, instead of being like, here are the answers, point A, point B, point C, and here's what Stanford offers, you could say, here's the need, here's how Stanford fills the need. Here's the other need, here's how Stanford fills the need. A very minor point, this is super nitpicky, but you said, well, I don't have marketing experience and entrepreneurial experience. I think you mentioned them in that order. To the extent that the entrepreneurial experience is the bigger gap in your knowledge, and frankly, since that's what Stanford is famous for, like if this were your Kellogg interview, I might have you switch the order, because Kellogg is very good at entrepreneurship, but they're very, very good at marketing. So I might have you mention those so that it resonates more, like, oh, we could totally help this guy. My school is going to be perfect for him. So also just put them in the order of importance, or what's from the biggest gap down to the smallest gap in your knowledge. And so then you answered, well, why Stanford? I talked to a lot of people. They were great. They were so supportive. So that was a nice thing to add. I think I would have mentioned that closer to the end. I think I first would have focused on what are the Stanford specific, the more uniquely quote unquote Stanford things that Stanford offers, because lots of schools have close, tight-knit communities. Tuck, Duke, a bunch of them, Ross, there's so many schools that have amazingly, these tight family style communities. But there are some things that only Stanford offers that are very unique to them. And so that's why I would have started talking about the entrepreneurial offerings, then maybe gone down to marketing. I would have just touched upon marketing very quickly, and then moved to leadership, and then say, and finally, it's the community, right? When I connected with people in the community, I realized the value of how everyone there is so supportive. I also think that I really would have liked a couple of more specifics in terms of which specific classes you would want to take. The only specific class, if I remember correctly, was a negotiations class in the law school. I don't think you mentioned any specific courses at the School of Business, and it was just kind of funny that the only specific class you mentioned in your business school interview is not, in fact, a business school class.
That's correct. As soon as I ended the answer, I realized, oh, wow, I forgot to mention the two classes I wanted to talk about entrepreneurship, which was growing, the startup garage and managing growing enterprises. Yes. I'm like, too late. I did this on purpose, so now it's
exactly. Thank you, Mervyn, for doing this on purpose so that others can learn. Because in real life,
that's such a blatant lie. Everyone knows it.
It's a fake mock interview, though, so any reality we want can be the reality that we
sure.
So entrepreneurship, startup garage. I would have also mentioned the D school class along the entrepreneurial offerings, even though technically it's in another school. It's so intertwined with so many people take this D. For those of you who don't know, D school stands for the design school. And I think I would have said not just Startup Garage and a class at the D school, but it would have been even a little bit stronger if you could have said something like a class at the D school. I'm especially looking forward to learning about or trying to think of new ways, new packaging designs for my future product. And the D school will let me really focus on that. So that way you're not just saying, well, I'm really interested in the design school, because who wouldn't be interested in the design school? But this is why, for me, the design school class is going to be useful. So I think that could have been just those little extra details could have been good. You also mentioned the Arbuckle Fellowship, which is great, right? This is one of Stanford's sort of famous. For those of you who may not know, Stanford is completely famous for having really transformational leadership classes that really focus on how are you perceived by others? How can you maximize your influence and power in certain situations? And the Arbuckle Fellows are the second-year mentors who guide the first years. So I love that you mentioned the Arbuckle Fellows. And at first, while you were talking about it, I wrote like any past experience. And then what was good here is that you said, oh, I actually, in particular, because I used to do this in college, I used to mentor people in college. I still mentor people today. That's really important for anyone listening to this. If you say something like, oh, I'm going to get involved with leading the Women in Business Club at this school, I'm going to get involved in X way, please have it be something that you've actually shown a concrete commitment to in the past, because otherwise we could all just be like, yeah, we're all going to be Arbuckle Fellows. Sure. Okay, great. But are you just saying that because you know it's something that I might like to hear? Or do you actually have a commitment, a proven commitment of being a mentor to others? And so by bringing up the fact, like, I used to do this in college, that's why I want to be an Arbuckle Fellow, that was really good, because you gave me that evidence that this is really who you are, and you're not just making up something that sounds good. In fact, a very minor change here would have been to say, to start with that evidence and then tell me what that evidence leads to. So say something like, because, another thing that interests me about Stanford and the leadership development is not just the classes itself, but also, in college, I was a mentor to others. I really love doing it. And that's why I would love to be an Arbuckle Fellow. Just to sort of, so that there isn't even that moment of that question mark that pops over my head, like, well, have you ever done anything like that before? If you start with the evidence and then what that leads to, there's no question, because it flows together super nicely. And then finally, there were some more, I have some more, like a couple more specifics that would have been nice. So instead of saying, well, there's this club that has, you said, lots of activities. Is there a specific activity that you are particularly looking forward to? Not just like, they do lots of stuff and it's great, so I want to come here. Again, picking an activity that you think would be particularly useful for you. And similarly, there's a proximity to Silicon Valley and there are all these great speakers. Is there a VC in Silicon Valley that has ties to Stanford that specializes in new food startups? In the past, was there a so-and-so person from this company? In fact, just last year, you guys had 3 different food entrepreneurs come to campus who live in Silicon Valley, who came to speak on campus, right? So that way you're tying it more to you, because I would love to go to school near Silicon Valley and you would love to go to school near Silicon Valley, but our reasons are completely different. I'm an ed tech entrepreneur, you're an aspiring food entrepreneur. So we both want to be in Silicon Valley, but for very different reasons. So just, again, to tie it to you and your story and how it supports your story.
Oh, yes, I completely agree. That was an oversight.
No, it's something you did on purpose so that I could give you that feedback and we could help the people watching this.
Yeah.
So moving on, I asked you, what's the motivation for this? And this is where you said, well, when I was a kid, I experimented in the kitchen. That's what led me to become a chemie. Right now, anyone who has children who love experimenting in the kitchen, their eyes just lit up like, oh, does this mean my kid's going to become a chemical engineer? Yes, ka-ching, awesome. I did internships in new product development, or you did internships in food related things. I think something that could really help benefit this is, I would love for there to be a broader vision, a broader why, and something a little bit more specific to the vision. So as far as, if I remember correctly, you said, well, I want to start a new food company someday, sort of.
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, but you didn't say, like, which specific food and the why. What's your why? Do you want to do something that is food for infants that are malnourished? Do you want to do luxury caviar for the upper classes in Mumbai? Like, you could do anything in between those. So I think a little bit more of like, obviously my plans might change, but as of right now, I'm thinking that I'm going to start a condiments business that sells whatever type of product to whatever type of market. And if there happens to be a social enterprise aspect to it, so much the better. Mention that as part of your motivation. There doesn't have to be a social enterprise aspect, though. I don't want people to be like, oh shoot, now I need to pretend that I want to start this caviar business to save starving children. They don't have to be that way. But if you're going to talk about something that isn't necessarily a social enterprise or has some sort of social benefit, you can at least tell me why this is an exciting opportunity, right? If we keep, I don't know why caviar, I don't know, but let's just stick with that example. If you stick with caviar, you can say, well, did you actually know that blah, blah, blah is growing in India at a certain percent? And, the government is switching its tariffs. So now it will be cheaper to import this stuff. And it's, so at least you get me excited about the market opportunity, about how things are growing, or why is this a particular opportunity that interests you? I think that goes a long way. If we think about Stanford's, their most famous essay question is, what matters most to you and why? They really want to know your motivation behind doing things. Like, are you just doing it? I'm not saying, Mervin, that this is you, but is somebody just doing it because they want to impress other people? Or are they just doing it? Or when they say, I want to start a company that helps feed these starving children, like, are they really serious about that? So I think a little bit more specificity around, and if it's like, well, how do you know that this is what you want to do? Like, well, that's why I'm going to Stanford, right? Obviously, this could change. Obviously, when I ideate through the startup garage, these things might change, but as of right now, this is where I want to go. The plan might change, but I think it's important to have a plan. So at least you've thought about it. Okay. So I had, tell me about a time that you failed. Okay, so I had just started working at a factory. I was setting up a huge plant. There were tons of people. There were conflicts. I was the hot shot walking in from my fancy pants university, and there was a huge vendor that wasn't being safe. And so I shut them down, and I said, I don't care if you've got 200 people here. I don't get, like, the rules are the rules, and it's the Mervin way or the highway. And so we're shutting things down. And then that, surprisingly, it ruined your relationship with that vendor. I can't imagine why. And so what I liked about this is, first of all, you absolutely took ownership for the failure. That is excellent. A lot of people, when they're asked, well, did you tell me about a time you failed? Some people will try to avoid their part in the failure, and they'll try to wiggle their way around it and say something like, oh, I once missed a deadline, but that's because Mark over in marketing completely, he didn't get me his stuff in time, and so I failed. It's like, no, you're blaming somebody else, or you're blaming COVID. That's one I've heard recently too. It's like, oh, I had this project and it failed because COVID had shut down the supply chain. And I'm like, no, that's not you failing. That's the world falling apart. So anyway, so what I liked about this is that you acknowledge, like, this is what I did wrong. I thought mistakenly that showing them the law, being the new policeman in town, and this ruling with the stick and not the carrot was the way to go. And so I think you did a really good job here of being distilling what your role in this problem was, and also then, though, you didn't just leave it at that. You then explained what you learned from it and how you implemented that learning in a future scenario. This is something that in the lab, I refer to as the silver lining technique. Right? This thing went wrong, and it was a hard lesson to learn, and boy, oh boy. But the good news is that because I made this mistake early on, I have avoided similar mistakes in the future. This can also happen if somebody, let's say, has a low GPA from college because they were working really hard. They had to work 2 jobs to support them. Look, the bad news is, yeah, my GPA wasn't high, but the good news is that I learned a really strong work ethic. Or the good news is I was able to help my family financially, right? So if you have something bad in your background or a failure or something, try to position it as ultimately something positive in terms of your development or developing a strong personality trait. So I thought your answer to this was excellent.
Well, thank you. I think I forgot to mess this one up.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I was trying to send you the invisible signal, but you didn't catch it, but that's okay.
Yeah, I was too engrossed in my story.
Well, now you have 2 failures you can talk about in your next interview. I'm just kidding, Irvin. Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to give another interview.
Just send them this recording if you get any more invites. Just be like, here you go. Okay. Okay, so tell me about an achievement. So in my third role, I was building a new product with this other company. We were co-developing it together. But both of these teams had very, very different different styles of working. We were really agile and they were slow and methodical, and so there was a clash of cultures. And so they messed up the formulations. And it was a pretty big mess up, right? It wasn't like a minor, like we violated the product claims, and also it got moldy or it didn't survive the 3-month shelf test or whatever that's called. So this time, because I had learned, I didn't just sort of drop the hammer on everyone. I started asking why, what's going on. I figured out like, oh, we can complement each other. Our different styles of working are actually complementary. It's not necessarily a problem. So I split it up. My team did this and their team did that. And I got them talking together. And so there was a part at the end where you said something like, oh, I wanted, in order to prevent this from happening in the future, I went to the COO or CEO, and I said, at my expense, I want to have monthly reviews with you at my expense. Did you mean by that? At first I was like, what's the expense involved? And then I thought, oh, it might be a reputational expense, right? If I have this meeting with a senior person and they show up and things are just a complete zoo over here, I'm going to look really bad. Was that what you meant?
Oh yeah, partly, but also like inviting deeper scrutiny is more work for me because I have to prepare all these presentations and explain everything every few weeks.
But the silver lining is that it helps keep you accountable, and therefore helps keep the team accountable. So I think the achievement here was I was able to bring together. You might even want to start the answer with something like this. You might say, my greatest achievement was I was able to bring together 2 groups that had completely different working styles that at first clashed, and I figured out a way to turn it from clashing into complementary. And then you go into the story, because then that way I'm not wondering like, where is this going?
Oh yeah, that I messed on purpose.
No, it was great. Thank you. I appreciate that. I'll okay. So then I sort of asked like, well, how did it get to that point? Like, shouldn't you have done things a little bit differently? Like, let's be honest, it probably shouldn't have. Some of these mistakes might have ideally been caught a bit earlier in the process. But I was able to take advantage of I was able to learn the best practices of both firms. I think you wrote, I was so engrossed in my own superior work culture, but they had superior processes. So I maybe just don't say my own superior culture. Just say I was used to this more agile way of going. It was the only way I really knew how to move forward. And so when I met them, instead of appreciating, now I appreciate that there's a method to their madness. Or not, that's not a good phrase to use. And now I appreciate that doing things in a methodical way is actually really beneficial. And then you said, and when you started reflecting on, well, why did this happen? I think you said something like, well, I just wanted to get this done quickly, right? I wanted to do things quickly. And so that's why I sort of was like, okay, guys, go, 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 without sitting down and hammering out some of this stuff first. But what was interesting was that, and then I asked a follow-up question about like, well, how did you have to innovate on the fly? And so you said, well, yeah, we ended up figuring out ways that we could work in parallel and not be reinventing the wheel or not be doing the same amount of redundant work. And we actually ended up moving more quickly because we could save time. We could each focus on what we were good at. One thing that I think you could have tried to summarize this. You could have said something, the irony is that this problem happened because I was trying to save time, but actually I ended up wasting time because I was so focused on going quickly that I actually, ironically, I slowed things down. So now I've learned that going a little bit more slowly up front can help prevent these misunderstandings from happening and can, in fact, overall make the total project end on time. So a little lesson there, like a pithy sort of one-liner of the lesson could be a good thing just to add. But this is just me being
No, I
nitpicky.
appreciate it. This is all great feedback.
Thanks, Mervin. I'll Venmo you the the bribe that we talked about before we got started. Thanks, I appreciate it.
Sure.
Okay, so the final question that you had been asked was, describe an experience where you contributed to a team effort, but you weren't the leader, you were a team member. So this was one where I could really picture it. We had a factory, but you can't, if you go from orange juice to a fruit punch, that first few batches of fruit punch are going to be full of orange juice, and so you got to do stuff to clean it out. I'm guessing, in order to switch things over. Is there a way we could do it better? Could we do it cheaper? But I was too swamped. And so 2 to 3 months later, this person joined who was sort of like a genius who made this amazing application that solved the problem. So I think what I liked about this answer is that you gave a lot of credit to this other employee, right? I think a person who is maybe less self-aware or who is more full of themselves would have been like, and I did an amazing job managing this young kid to do exactly, as his boss, I did such a good job being his boss that I guided him to solve the solution. So what was really nice about this was that you sort of admitted, like, thank goodness for this kid showing up, or I'm just assuming it was a younger person. Maybe it wasn't a younger person, but thank goodness for this new employee showing up, because I was just amazed at how well they worked. They did it on their own and it solved the problem and it was fantastic. So I loved that you gave credit to other people, because that's a sign of maturity, and no one can do anything by themselves. So it's a good acknowledgement of that. I think my sort of concern with this particular answer was that you weren't really in the team. I wanted to try to picture you in a team. So like if I were to be on a team with you and we were to try to solve an issue together, how would you be acting in that team, right? Some people are the people who are like, okay, guys, we've been wasting too much time, let's go forward. And other people on a team are like, hey, like maybe we should take a step back and think about this. And other people are like, I'm going to be really quiet, but I'm the one who's going to, behind the scenes, make sure that people aren't fighting anymore. So I think I love the story in general, and I love how you approached it. But the biggest challenge was just that I had a problem and someone showed up and they fixed it. Hooray. And it didn't really give me a sense of you working with somebody else in terms of how were you as a member, especially where you didn't have authority. I think part of the key to that question is that, because not anyone, but it's a lot easier to get people to do stuff when you're in charge. But if you are in a team environment where you're surrounded by peers or maybe even people who are senior to you, it might not be as easy to influence them. And so how do you either influence others? How do you help others? What's the role that you play in a team? So I think that I love the story. I just, and so thanks for telling this story, this sort of fake story. But the good news is the story makes you look good. It just wasn't necessarily you interacting with the other person. But so that's all of my feedback. Do you have any questions or comments?
There are a lot of questions in the comments, but for me, it was a great experience. I learned a lot, even though I was done with the interview. This has given me a lot to think about, and probably there are a few ways in which I can improve my answers. I admit they're not perfect, and yes. So thank you so much for doing this, Ria.
Thank you, Mervin. I think you've done the GMAT Club community a great service. And again, these were nitpicky. I mean, this was not like, oh, it was a bad interview and whew, this is going to be a rough one. I was literally taking answers that were already good and just providing little, it was a marginal improvement because you did a good job.
Oh, thank you.
Of course. Okay, so we've got some questions popping up. Sam2411, could you share a sample answer to the question on working with a diverse team or someone from a different background? So Sam, this is a great question because especially with the increasing emphasis on diversity and inclusion, et cetera, also because the world is just getting smaller and smaller. And so the chances that we will at some point in our careers have to work with people very different from us on some level is probably about 100%. So if you're talking about working with someone from a different background, first of all, you have to explain what it was about them that was different, and you have to tread lightly here. First of all, don't ever put anyone else down. So let's say a common example is if somebody is in the workplace and they have a junior employee that joined, but that junior employee was the first in their family to go to college. Their parents are all blue collar manual laborers, and so they don't have good manners in front of a client. Let's say that's sort of a more subtle one. Instead of being like, well, oh, we had this kid join and he did not even know. I mean, he would just show up to the meetings in shorts and a t-shirt, and it was so embarrassing because his parents. That you don't want to throw anyone else under the bus. You want to describe if this was in fact something like this person comes from a lower level of resources, and you try to help guide them. Instead of throwing them under the bus and being like, oh, you would not believe how terrible this, you should say something like, it was understandable. We initially were having some issues with a new employee who was not behaving in a very professional way in front of clients. However, it was understandable because they were the first in their family to go to college, so they didn't have any role models to tell them in advance, like, this is how you behave in a professional environment. So then I took them aside and did blah, blah, blah. No matter what, a diversity inclusion type of question should have you taking some sort of action, right? So positive action. So if it's a case of, another common one could be, my firm only invests in male founders. And I was like, well, why aren't we investing in any female founders? Again, it's not just like, wow, it really sucks that we don't invest in female founders. I wish someone would do something about that. Oh, well, on with my day. Like, no, ideally, this is something where at least you tried to change something. So the two keys here are describe why this other person was quote unquote diverse or different from you in a non-judgmental way. So, or like, let's make fun of the Germans. Sorry if there are any Germans here, but let's say it's like, oh, I was working on this international team and this guy from Germany he was so anal retentive, and the meeting had to start exactly 2 seconds after 10 o'clock and it was driving me crazy. You can't do that, right? You have to be like, oh, I was working with someone from Germany and wow, they are very good at being precise. Right? So you're still explaining the difference, but you're not doing it in a way that makes them look bad. And then you also have to explain what you did to solve things, even if at the end you weren't able to drive ideally you were able to drive some sort of positive change. But if you weren't able, at least you talk about like, oh, at least I tried, right? I wasn't able to convince my managing director right now, but I'm still going to keep going after it and still try to make this change. All right, what's the next question? By the way, I don't know, does Mervin, do you want to like keep sitting here? Like he's out of the hot seat right now. So well, maybe, who knows? Maybe some questions will come up for him.
I hope not. Okay.
I know. Someone's gonna be like, Mervin, tell me about a time that you did.
Oh yeah, I'm terrified of being interviewed now. I'm like, okay, can I please be done with this?
If you want to jump out, by the way, I think it's fine. We've tortured you long enough. Your service.
Oh no, I'm good. I mean, it's perfectly fine with me.
Okay. All right. Well, if you change your mind, thank you for your service, and you are free from the spotlight.
If I change my mind, I'm going to click this cross button on the top right of my screen and
leadership. That's right.
Yes, initiative.
Got it. I love it. Oh, great. Okay, so moving on. Pranjal wants to know, how do you explain that you want to change industries? You work for consulting and you've had projects with clients across different domains. So if you have, now you want to move to healthcare because you found it most engaging. Okay, so I was going to say, no matter what, if you are changing industries, your story is going to be a lot better if you can point to things in your past that contribute in some way to making you an attractive candidate in the future industry. So if you were a consultant who had only worked with retail clients and had never worked with healthcare, and you suddenly said, well, I want to switch to healthcare. If we think about the question I asked Mervyn earlier, it's like, well, why? Like, how do you even know you're going to like healthcare? How do you, like, the healthcare system's a mess? Like, why? So if you're a consultant though, and you've worked with lots of different clients, then you can say, well, I've worked with all these clients, but the most interesting project was my healthcare client. And it really made me realize that blah, 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 blah. And here's the change I want to make. And that's why this is where I want to go. So two things. So the career change cannot be a complete 180-degree out of the blue. I've been a Teach for India fellow, working in a rural school, and now I want to go be a brand manager at Louis Vuitton. Like, whoa, like, I can't, like, it doesn't. So at least it has to grow from something you've done in the past. The more you've done in the past with it, the better, because that way you're building credibility and you're alleviating my anxiety as an admissions officer that, oh my gosh, what if this person doesn't get that job? What if they come to business school, they take out $180,000 of debt to come to our business school? I think in Indian terms, for those of you, I think it's like a crore or a crore and a half or something like those, along those lines. Kaun banega crorepati. You guys are all too young for that show, but anyway, it was an old show. Anyway, so the point is, it's a lot of money to go to business school. And the worst outcome is if somebody who has no shot at all of getting the post-MBA job that they want to get, if they go to business school, they take out all that money, they spend the 2 years at business school, and then at the end, they can't actually get that job because they didn't research in advance. How does this industry hire from business school? I don't have any relevant background, and so nobody's even interviewing me. And when I do get interviewed, I get dinged immediately. Then that person's going to be really mad, and then they're going to like go and be like, oh, this money and I had to get to work in a hedge fund, and now I can't work in a hedge fund, and I'm so angry. And then they go and they say bad things on the message board, and it's just a nightmare for everyone. So my primary anxiety around career vision as an admissions officer is this person actually going to get this job? Because if not, I don't want any blame on me. And number two, can my program help them? Like, is my program going to be the best program to help them reach that goal? Because otherwise, even if I let them in, then they're going to go to another school and my statistics on yield go down. So emphasize, Pranjal, the fact that you have the healthcare experience. Focus on that. If as part of this, you have a chance to talk to people at your healthcare client and you can drop in a quote or two into that essay, or sorry, into the interview answer about like, yeah, I actually spoke with 3 people at my client and they said that if I get an interview, they would love to hire me afterwards. So much the better. So if you are making a career change, also try to get evidence that I've spoken to 3 HR managers in my target field, and they have said that after an MBA, I could be a competitive candidate. That alleviates so much of the pressure, and that's how you position that. How does Stanford interviewees respond to or asks questions about low GPA, less academic focus? Is there any way they take backlogs in a positive outlook? So first of all, Nitish, if they thought that your academic performance in college was an unforgivable obstacle, you would not have gotten invited to interview in the first place. So the fact that you even make it to the interview round says that they are willing or potentially willing to overlook your poor grades in college. So right off the bat, if it's really bad, you're not going to get the interview to begin with. So if you're asked about it in the interview, think back to the silver lining technique I briefly touched upon earlier. So you can say something like, hey, my grades my first 2 years of college were really bad, but it's because I was working to support my family. I was caring for an ill relative. I was the first in my family to go to college, and I didn't know how to adapt. I didn't know what was waiting for me. And so based on that, like, yes, it happened, and I wish it didn't, but it did. But the good news is that from it, I grew as a person in the following way. I got really good at managing my time. I learned to advocate for myself. Whatever it is that you took away from that, try to put a positive spin on it. And then if you continue to get asked questions about it, the number one way to overcome a low GPA is with a very high GMAT. That right off the bat helps answer a lot of questions. It marks the box. Okay, they can handle the work here. Let's move on to our next area of focus. So if you get asked about it, that's what you can say. But yeah, if they were really worried, they just wouldn't even bother inviting you.
Also, Maria, I think it's very unlikely that someone would ask this question since the interview is blind.
Exactly. They would only ask you that if you put your own GPA on your resume, and if that GPA was not good, especially if by any chance if they matched your interviewer with someone who went to your college, and so they understand your college's grading scale, and so so if somebody goes to, like, I don't know, let's say an IIT, and they get an 8 out of 10, someone else who is like, oh, that's actually pretty good because it's really hard to get, but if you show up and if you put your GPA on the resume and it's not good, then you're right. That's the only way they would find out about it, really. They might ask in a blind interview, like, so what do you think is the weakest aspect of your candidacy? Or why, sometimes if people are in a grumpy, weird mood, they might say, like, why should we take you and why shouldn't we take you? I haven't heard Stanford do a lot of that, but so yeah, you could say something like, well, if I were the admissions office, I might be concerned about my GPA. It wasn't great, but blah, blah, blah. And then you pivot quickly and focus on the positive aspects of the story. Okay. Tell us about a situation when you worked with an uncooperative or difficult team. How can this Ross question best be answered? So lots of schools will ask a variation of this question. I think, as I mentioned before, for the diversity type of question, if you're working with someone who is different from you, first of all, do not throw anyone under the bus. Even if in real life, that person you were working with was a lazy sociopath who was just terrible, I get it. I have worked with people like that too. But for the purposes of the interview, you can't say that. So if you work with someone who wasn't pulling their own weight or who wasn't meeting deadlines, you have to say something like, okay, yeah, once I was on a team and, Mark was lying to our boss about the work he was doing. He wasn't actually doing the work. And so what I did is, and then here's where ideally, hopefully you acted with some level of compassion instead of, early stage Mervin 1.0, who would have been like, you're fired and you're terrible and you get out of here. I know it's so tempting though. I wish there are definitely some people I wish I could have done that to in my career. But if they're your peers, then you don't have a choice. So instead of being, ideally there's something where there's some compassion involved. So you said, I pulled him aside and I said, hey man, like, what's going on with you? We've had these deadlines. You're not really helping. What's going on? And then hopefully that you're able to uncover something about them or about the situation that helps you then move the project forward. So I discovered that I'm going to pick a random. I discovered that his pet had died and he was really sad about it, and so he wasn't showing up to work. Or I discovered that he had a health issue. I was recently doing a mock interview for someone who had this situation where someone on their team wasn't helping, and it turns out that their spouse had actually passed away, but they didn't want to tell anyone at work about it for whatever reason, and so they just weren't doing a good job. But of course they weren't doing a good job. So, and no one would do a good job in that situation. So I think you have to show compassion with the difficult team member instead of just being like, oh, they were terrible. And then talk about how you overcame that. If in real life, the answer was, we just stopped talking to him and we just did the work ourselves, that's not a good answer, because it shows you not wanting to develop others. It shows you sort of being dismissive of people. I think most people have good intentions most of the time. And so if we assume that they have bad intentions and we cut them out, or we denigrate them, we're like, you're terrible, just leave me alone. That's not very good in terms of long-term team building. So show how you were compassionate and then show how you solved the issue. Okay, next question. Okay. Oh, we can ask Mervin this. So since Stanford is a school that has a lot of info online, what's a question you can ask someone at the end of the interview? Mervin, were you given an opportunity to ask your interviewer questions?
Oh, yes, definitely. And oh, yeah, it's not the AdCom, it's an alum. So you have more liberty with the kind of questions you can ask. The best kind of questions are those that end on a positive note. You don't want to ask something negative. So, for example, you will ask them what their favorite memory at campus was, what kind of clubs they were involved in, what surprised them as an international student. In my case, they were an international student as well. So I asked them what they felt was unique about the culture there that they did not know about prior to getting there. Something along those lines always works great.
Mervin,
Maria, you could probably add.
I could not have said it any better myself. That is 100% my advice. This is not the time for you to ask the alum, like, so, like, are you making a lot of money now? Or like, so, like, is it true that Stanford, like, are you really going to get a good job out of Stanford? Or, why did their employment statistics go down last year? Or in this latest ranking, they went from number 1 to number 2. Aren't you worried about that? You do not want to bring up anything that might be negative, because if you think about it, this is you want to end on a high note. This is their last impression that they're going to take away from their conversation with you. And so you want to ideally have them have like warm, fuzzy feelings. So that way they associate you with the warm and fuzzy feeling that your very nice question generated in them. And so for me, it's exactly what Mervin said. It's not like, so isn't it true that your campus culture is actually really, no, this is not the time. Besides, you're not in yet. Once you get in, you can ask all the difficult questions you want. But this is the time where you're like, what was your favorite aspect, or what was the most pleasant surprise? Not what was the biggest surprise, because then they're like, oh, it's blah blah blah, something negative. What was the most pleasant surprise, or what was your favorite class? What was your favorite professor? Who was your most inspiring classmate? I hear that Stanford in particular loves to admit inspiring people, and I've heard about these talks where people get really raw and honest about their backgrounds, and what was the most inspiring story someone else shared with you? Those sorts of questions, that's going to be, don't go controversial and don't go negative. Berglagadish. So why shouldn't we select you? How to answer this question smartly? I think you answered your own question in the second part here. Should we go negative or change the negativity? Well, to hide it and show positivity, I wouldn't hide it, because then it's very clear. If I ask someone like, so what's a weakness? And they're like, I'm too much of a perfectionist. And it's like, that's not really a weakness. I mean, it can be, but you're just trying to brag a little bit and hide the brag as though it's called a humble brag. Some people call it. So I think you could say like, well, if I had to think about why I shouldn't be selected, it might be that I have not yet managed other people. However, this is exactly why I need the MBA, because that way, when I do eventually manage people, I'll be ready for it. Or the GPA, as we described before, my grades weren't great, but here's why. And ultimately, I grew from the experience. So don't hide the negativity, but mention it briefly, and mention it in a very matter-of-fact way. So don't try to be like, oh, I failed the first 2 semesters of college, but it's no big deal. Like, don't try to gloss over it, but also don't be like, oh, I'm terrible because I'm a terrible, fundamentally flawed human being. I failed those first 2 semesters. Like, don't beat yourself up either. Just sort of state, very matter of fact, here's a situation that I think concerns the AdCom, but here's why they either shouldn't worry about it, and you could also provide evidence. So if we're talking about an academic concern, that's why I hope that instead of my GPA, they look at my GMAT score as evidence that I can handle the classroom. That's why, even though I was fired from my first job out of college, but from it, I learned so much. And so I would hope that they would focus on all of my successes since then. So you can try to provide sort of a counterweight to the negativity. I don't know how the camera has me backwards. A counterweight to the negativity that proves that negative thing is either not a concern or something that could be addressed by the MBA program, or was ultimately a good thing that happened to you.
And I think, Maria, a very common variation of this question is, what is the weakest part of your application? Maybe you could talk about how to answer that as well.
Yeah. So I think it's sort of saying things like, okay, if I were the admissions committee, I think that they're probably most concerned about blank. And then, but here's why I would hope that they would instead focus on whatever it is, the positive. I hope that they would instead realize that I actually grew from this experience and that it was ultimately a good thing for me.
Yeah, for example, I was asked this question, and I think for a lot of us, we don't have a lot of international experience. That is probably one line to go on. And that is exactly why you want to do an MBA as well, to get that kind of international exposure.
Exactly. Perfect. Yeah, that's another great one, right? I don't have a lot of international experience, but that's exactly why I'm so looking forward to the whatever it's called, whatever the acronym is for the international program at your school. They all have different acronyms. But yeah, the global whatever immersion program or whatever. That's why I'm so excited for it. And I'm so excited that your class is so international and so diverse, right? That's a lot. That's another thing. A lot of schools they pride themselves on their diverse class, especially the European programs in particular. So my classmates are also going to be diverse. So I'm really looking forward to learning from that. Okay, do we have anything else? This has been one of the best sessions. Bragadish, now you're my favorite commenter of the day. Merv is the most respected student of some sort of community. I don't know what it is, but I believe you. I believe that he is the most respected student of any community he's a member of. He's great.
Thank you for your comments, but I've not been selected yet. I just gave the interview.
Yes, but if you think about the fact that Stanford, well, who knows what it's good. I mean, COVID kind of made everything go wonky, but historically, Stanford's had a 6% acceptance rate. And so they probably only invite about 12% of people to interview. You've already cleared, like, even just getting invited to interview. I know you're going to be like, who cares if I don't get in? But it really is an honor. And should you end up having to apply to other schools, it bodes well for getting, what your results will be at other schools, just because it is the hardest. Getting invited to interview at Stanford statistically is about the same as getting into Harvard if you just look at the raw percentages, right? So, the fact that they even picked you is a big testament to your accomplishments and your wonderful giving personality.
I don't know how to take a compliment, Maria, but thank you.
Now you can turn off the camera.
Yeah, good time.
You're like, okay, bye, sorry. And then you, okay. Sam 2411. Any tips on handling questions that catch you off guard? So Sam, first of all, don't try to completely BS your way through something, especially it depends who, if it's an alumnus, they might not be as they might not have their BS meters as tightly calibrated, but an admissions officer in particular has a very tight BS meter. So if you get a question that catches you off guard, let's say you get asked something like, oh, you want to work in, you want to make a cookie business that sells sweet cookies in India. How big is the cookie market today in India? Right? Let's say it's a question where you are like, I have no idea. Then you can say something like, oh, you know what? That's actually, you can, first of all, you can buy yourself time. That's a really great question. Give me a second to think about that. Perfectly acceptable. And if it's a question where you're caught off guard because you don't actually have any idea what the answer is, this is more likely to happen in the HBS interview, where sometimes you might get asked like, so what was the stock price last week? Or what do you think about that lawsuit that your corporation is dealing with right now in Europe, or something like that? If you really don't know anything about it, I think it's probably better just to say, that's interesting. I hadn't heard about that. Can you just give me a little bit of the background and I'd be happy to talk about it? Or, that number, let's see, I don't know exactly what the cookie market is in India, but I would estimate, first of all, you can just estimate something off the top of your head, right? If you almost think of it like as a mini case interview, where it's like, very quietly to yourself, you can think, okay, 1.2 billion people in India, hundreds of millions of households. If I take that number and I assume that each household buys 3 packets of cookies every month, right? So you can try to like very quickly kind of come up with something that way. An order of magnitude will be fine. But yeah, it's also fun. Look, another question that might catch people off guard sometimes is something where they don't actually have anything to talk about. So a common one is, have you ever faced an ethical dilemma? And some people haven't. They've just been lucky. They've worked with really good people and they've never had. And so I think it's also fine to be like, huh, I'm actually very fortunate. I've worked with people who have a lot of integrity, and yeah, luckily I don't have any ethical dilemmas. So remember, it's a real conversation with a real person. The admissions officer or the alumnus is a real person. And so you don't have to have like this perfect answer for everything. So that's my take on it. And Sam2411, if you have a more specific scenario that you're thinking of and you want to pop that into the comment box, go ahead and do that. And then I can try to hone in on something a little more concrete for you.
Yeah, I guess sometimes they do ask you if there's something is there something you want to tell them, or there's something that we haven't touched upon. So maybe, Maria, you could tell people how to answer a question like that.
Excellent. You're right. There are some times where they'll say, okay, well, those are all of my questions, but we still have 5 minutes left. So what would you like to talk about? Or, what haven't you shared with me yet that you would like to share? This is a common HBS one, actually. They will ask, if they get through all of their questions they have in advance, you might get an opportunity to direct the conversation next where you want it to go. So what I advise is come into the interview with a mental list of what your greatest hits are. So, okay, I really want them to know about this and this and this at work. These are the 3 things I'm proudest of at work. At school, I'm proudest of the fact that I organized the blah, blah, blah thing. And currently in my community, I'm proudest of the fact that I ran a 10K last year. I trained for my first race and I ran it last year, whatever. Let's say those are the 5 things you most want them to know. So first of all, if you go into the interview with your 5 things, and one of those things hasn't been touched upon yet, perfect, right? And you can buy yourself time to think about, to be like, okay, yeah, it's a great question. Let's see, we've touched upon these new ventures that I'm looking at acquiring. We touched upon the joint beverage project that I worked on. Oh, you know what? I wish you would have asked me about this thing I did in college where I did blah, blah, blah. And then you can direct the conversation that way. That's probably the easiest thing to do, because that way you're getting the most bang for your buck. If at that moment you're like, oh, what should I just mention something random about myself? Like, I really like cheese. Like, that's great. That's interesting. It might be quirky, but it's not, the return on investment is going to be pretty low. This could be an opportunity for you to bring up that leadership example from another context of your life, or something that you really want them to know about you from, let's say, maybe a passion. Like I said, maybe you're really proud of the fact that maybe you're supporting a family member financially, or you're doing something like that you want them to know. So go in though ready with that list. And in case you've already gone through the list, it's also, I think it's fine to say like, wow, actually we've covered everything. You've gotten to know me really well. So yeah, thanks for your time. This was a great conversation, and just get out of there. You also might want to have, like, just in case you're really desperate for things, like walk in with like a book that you're currently reading, or an interesting article that you've read recently, or a podcast that you've listened to that really helped give some sort of insight. You can say, wow, we've covered everything, but I guess I could share with you the fact that I'm currently reading 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel, and it's really interesting, in case you're desperate, in case you're like, oh no, am I going to run out of things to talk about? You probably won't run out of things to talk about, but if you do, at least have some sort of interest, like, oh, actually I was reading this article in the New York Times the other day about, this pug, this little dog that's a TikTok sensation because he predicts if people are going to have a good day or not. It's at least something to make conversation.
I think we're done.
I think we're done. I mean, we actually went, I think, 25 minutes over. Wasn't this supposed to be technically a 1 hour? Oh, thanks, GMAT Club. Thanks for the shout out. Yes, check out Applicant Lab's interview prep service. If you would like to access it, sign up for Applicant Lab, create your free account, and then when you click through to purchase, you can either purchase the full Applicant Lab with essays, resumes, all that stuff, or you can just buy the interview prep module. If you like the advice I gave here, you're going to love the interview prep module. It's only $99, and it's a ton of videos of me with like, here's a good answer to this question, here's a bad answer to this question. And I also covered things like the HBS specific interview, the Booth. Booth has like an interview question that you have to answer if you get invited to interview, etc. So I have got lots of stuff in there. So please do check it out. And thanks again to Mervin the Brave and Mervin the Generous, because you really didn't have to do this, man. And the fact that you did, I think, speaks volumes. I'll cut off my compliment here because I know you don't want to hear it, but it really does speak volumes too.
Yeah, I mean, my mouse is slowly edging towards the cross button on the top right corner.
You know what? Mine is too, because we have gone almost half an hour more than we should have, which as a percentage is almost 50% more. And so I think that our work here is done. So thanks to Mervin, thanks everyone for joining us here today, and have a great afternoon or morning or evening wherever you are. Thank you.
Bye-bye.